Welcome to the deep dive for this week. Don't forget to visit the website at deepdiveau.net. Check out our socials and Patreon page at the Deep Dive AU. Subscribe via your favourite podcast app or like and subscribe at our YouTube page at the Deep Dive AU.
The Deep Dive podcast mugs are now available for purchase and are currently on sale. Just go to our merchandise page at deepdiveau.net to purchase one. Don't miss out on this opportunity to grab one for yourself or as a thoughtful gift for a fellow podcast enthusiast.
This is the Deep Dive Podcast. And here is your host, Michael Coles.
Simon Ren is a husband and father, mental health advocate and social worker. As the founder of Mindful Men, he's dedicated to supporting men with mental illness and disability. Simon lived with OCD, depression, anxiety and burnout for 30 years, struggling in silence using alcohol to feel normal. At 28, Simon began the journey of healing and hopes to inspire others to believe that they can turn their pain into purpose and move from surviving to thriving. Simon Ren, welcome to the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me, Michael. Really excited to be here.
Okay, so what are the common signs and symptoms of OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder in men, and how can they be identified early?
It's a huge question, and I say it's huge because it's so complex. And OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder is something that's often misunderstood. So I always like to start these kinds of conversations about just defining what OCD actually is, because whenever we say OCD, we always hear people say, oh, yeah, I'm a little bit OCD, or I do these OCD-like things, but they don't actually know what it is. It's part of the neurodiverse family or community of mental health conditions, and it starts with an obsessive thought, an intrusive thought that we can't get rid of. No matter what we do, no matter how much we try to think about it, the thought goes round and round and round and round until we perform what's called a compulsion, which is the C in OCD, or a compulsive behavior. And that alleviates the anxiety that's caused from the obsessive thought itself. And so these two things happen concurrently, and it becomes a disorder because we do it a lot. So the clinical definition for the disorder is over an hour of your day is spent doing these obsessions and compulsions, and they're quite significant on your day as well. So it really starts with A, understanding what OCD is, and then B, what are the warning signs? What depends on what type of OCD you have. And so there's different themes of OCD. So for example, there's one called harm OCD. So that's where you have obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors that are associated with preventing harm for others or harm for yourself. Or you might have religious-based OCD themes. So you might be doing excessive praying because you're worried about not getting into heaven, for example. Others ones could be around what's called symmetry OCD, and that's one that a lot of people understand. It's where you have to have everything neat and perfect and in its perfect spot. Otherwise, it causes a lot of distress, and then it's when you go into a bit of a meltdown or a high anxiety-provoking situation as well. There's one called pure OCD. So that's where pure obsessions, so that's where the behaviors are thinking. So we get this thought in our head and the behavior becomes a thinking or a cognitive process. And so it's not visible to the outside eye. And so these are just some themes. There's many other themes as well. So it really depends on what the theme is. And I can go through a couple of different variations of what I've experienced. So I live with OCD. For me, it started when I was 8 years old. And it started in the schoolyard. Another student said to me, Simon, if you stop using your voice for more than a minute, you're going to lose your voice forever. And that scared the hell out of me. And so what I started to do, so that would be the obsessive thought of losing the voice. I started performing a compulsive behavior, which was humming to myself to check that my voice still existed. So every minute I'd go, try just checking that my voice still worked, basically. And over the years, I stopped doing that, so I don't do that anymore. But that's when it started, and then it went into the harm OCD one, which is one I live with. And so around 13, 14 years old, mum and dad separated. So me and my little brother, we moved out with mum to a new house, and I felt like I became the man of the house. And so every night I would go around the house and check every window was closed, every door was closed, because I had this obsessive thought that if the house wasn't locked up like Fort Knox, that some baddie was going to come into the house and do horrible things like steal our stuff. It could be hurt us, kidnap us, you name it. Some really bad stuff would happen to us if I didn't do these behaviors. And I would spend 2, 3, 4 hours a night doing this in the dark, and nobody knew. And so for me, OCD was a 20-year process of doing all these different types of checking behaviors, but nobody ever saw me do them or ever asked me, why do you do that, Simon? And so it took me going to a doctor and saying, I think I've got a bit of a mental health challenge here, to identify what OCD was for me, and depression and anxiety as well. But then it probably took another 10 years before I found even an OCD therapist who could actually walk me through how do you treat OCD as well. And so what are the early signs? Well, probably checking behaviors where someone is checking a lot, which can be really challenging, particularly with autistic folk, people that live with autism, because they might do similar behaviors, but it might not necessarily mean they have OCD. Sometimes they do that for a comforting thing, it's like a stimming thing, whereas someone who's like OCD doesn't really want to do it to because it's against their beliefs or ethos or value systems. So it can be challenging to pick out there. But it's a lot of checking behaviors. It could be repetitive behaviors, so doing the same thing over and over. Could be getting up and walking around, unable to sit still, thought processes that go really round and round. But really, it does take a bit of time to kind of explore and identify that this is actually OCD. And in fact, it takes probably on average around 13 years from first symptom to first treatment of OCD in the OCD space, because the thoughts are so scary and we don't want to share the thoughts because we fear what the other person might say, like what a doctor might say or a friend or a family member or a therapist. We feel like we can't share, and so we bottle it all up. So checking signs are probably the early things, and repetitive behavior is something else to look out for too.
Okay, so how does OCD uniquely affect men's mental health and daily functioning?
Well, it goes right to your values, right? And so in an OCD thought, often the thoughts are unwanted. You don't want the thoughts. They're very scary. They can be very intrusive. And some of them can get very dark. So, for example, harm OCD could be like if I was holding a kitchen knife or something like that. And then the thought comes into my mind, what happens if I accidentally cut myself? And then so what I do is I put the knife down. I don't want to touch the knife. So now I'm avoiding, cooking dinner because I'm scared of the knife. And so it really just depends on what it is and how it impacts us, because it goes right down our values. Like I like to prepare meals for my family, for example, because I'm a dad and a husband and I need to make dinner. But if I can't because the OCD gets in the way, like that really does impact me. And so it's about values. I mean, it depends on some of the other themes as well, like religious themes, or there's some other pretty scary ones there, but we don't want them. They're just intrusive thoughts, but we can't get rid of them without doing the compulsive behavior. So when it comes to men as well, it's also challenging because a lot of men struggle to talk about their mental health. So if they're experiencing these intrusive thoughts or these compulsive behaviors, they don't know how to share it because maybe they've been taught not to share, or they're scared of sharing because it might mean like they're less of a man, for example. And so these are things that through conversations just like this, we can start to unpack that and to show men that it's okay to talk about this stuff and get it diagnosed, because once we know it, then we can kind of work through it with different therapy or medication or other well-being type of activities.
Okay, so what therapeutic approaches does Mindful Men offer to help men manage their OCD symptoms?
Yeah, so I guess there's a combination of ways that you can explore it. And me as a practitioner, so I'm a social worker, and as a practitioner in the mental health and disability space, I draw on a couple different therapy modalities. And some of the audience might have heard things like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, or acceptance and commitment therapy, which is called ACT. I draw heavily on these two types of therapies to support men to tune into values and ground themselves in the moment, but also to challenge thoughts that come to their mind. But really for OCD, there is a gold standard treatment that is available. It's called exposure response prevention, so ERP. And the idea with this, it differs to cognitive behavioral therapy because CBT, and there's a lot of these acronyms, so I'm sorry for anyone listening who doesn't like acronyms, but CBT, the general idea is that by changing your thoughts, you can change your emotions and then your behavior as well. With OCD, it's not about changing our thoughts because the thoughts will always happen. With OCD, what we want to do is change the behavior. So we actually want to stop the checking, because it's the checking that reinforces the obsessive thoughts and reinforces the conditions. So for me, if I was to walk around my house and check every door, window, etc., I do that in a routine. So it's the front door, then it's the front window, and I go around the house in a circle. ERP kind of mixes all that up. And so the idea with exposure response prevention is to expose ourselves to what triggers us. So for me, it's locking up the house, and to prevent what is the typical response. So for me, it's about not doing the front door first. It's maybe doing that last. Or maybe it's, if I'm feeling really good, it's missing a window, not checking a window, like actually skipping a step and really messing up with the steps. And what we want to do is, over time, with graduated exposure, is learn to sit with the anxiety that happens with the obsessive thoughts, but not respond to them in a behavioral way, because it's that behavioral response that, as I said before, reinforces the obsessions that we have. So ERP is certainly the gold standard treatment, and it depends on what your themes are as well, and what your obsessions are and what your compulsions are, as to what you specifically do to treat your version of OCD.
Okay, so how can men overcome the stigma associated with seeking help for OCD and other mental health conditions?
I think this conversation that we're having is one perfect example. It's actually talking about our mental health, right? It's actually recognizing that we're allowed to have emotions and feelings and mental distress, and we're allowed to express that in a healthy way. So we're allowed to have a chat with a friend or a family member about how we're going, and know that it's okay, that it's not weak if we do this. Like, it's actually something that takes a lot of courage and strength, and recognize that we can go and talk to our GP, or we can go and talk to a therapist, whether it's a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a counselor, a social worker like me, and get help. So recognizing these things, and that we don't have to do it alone, that we don't have to try and outthink this, because you'll never outthink OCD. OCD will always outthink you. That's the nature of it. And so it's about doing things like self-care as well, tuning into that. Like, are we drinking too much? So for 25 years, I used alcohol to slow my brain down. And so by me getting sober at 40, I'm like learning other tools like breath work or meditation, or doing more exercise, or, talking more, like going to see my therapist more regularly is a great way. But it starts with conversations like this and challenging those social constructs that we were all brought up with. So, like, for example, I'm not sure about you, Michael, but where I grew up and when I was born, it was weak to speak for guys. It was about, you have to be like tough and strong and courageous and never shed a tear. So for us, I'm a young dad, so maybe it's me teaching my son that he can cry and he doesn't have to be tough all the time, that he can share his emotions, and supporting him through that. And we're leading by example by doing the same as well. So in this household, I am the emotional one. So I do cry in front of my children and show them, it's okay for dads to cry and be upset. But it's also okay for me to ask my wife for help or somebody for help, and then, go down that pathway to improving my mental health. So it starts with conversations just like this, and I love being here having this chat with you.
Yep. So I know the attitudes are actually changing, and also sort of like the stigma is actually sort of changing as well, because I think sort of having that vulnerability, I think, is sort of essential for anybody to actually sort of improve their mental health to a degree.
Absolutely. And COVID, I mean, people say there was a lot of bad stuff that happened at COVID. COVID for me was a period of time that allowed or opened the door to these conversations, because everyone was stuck at home. We were all in lockdown. Everyone was like, if you're working, your boss would tune into you and so forth. So I think it really did help the last couple of years. As you said, it's opening more conversations up to mental health. And we're having, the Deep Dive podcast is a classic example of that. Like, it's a podcast that shares stories and shares insights and shares lived experience. And once we do this, we start to inspire those listening to go, I've been checking the door lots lately, or I've been doing these repetitive behaviors. Maybe I should go and talk to someone about this because it's distressing me, or it's causing a bit of anxiety or whatever. But it is slowly changing, but we've got a long way to go in the men's space, because we are hard nuts to crack. So it's going to take a while, but I'm glad we are doing it through, episodes like this and what I did with the Mindful Men podcast and other podcasts that are coming around the world as well.
Okay, so what role does mindfulness play in managing OCD, and how can men incorporate it into their daily routines?
Yeah, so OCD for me is a brain that never switches off. It's like a hamster on a hamster wheel. It goes faster and faster and faster. So mindfulness, I find, it's not for everybody, but I find it's really helpful for me to slow that process down, to slow the thinking down. So there's a couple of elements to it. For one, it's how do we breathe? When you think about when we're anxious or stressed, we're breathing really fast, like we've just run a marathon. So it's about calming our nervous system down. It's about grounding ourselves in the moment. It's about being present. So like me in a conversation with you, I can see you, I can hear you, we're having a great conversation. There's been times in my life where I've been talking to people and it's like I'm on a different planet. I'm sitting there nodding, or I'm having a conversation, but I'm not really present. So mindfulness helps us be present in the moment. So I tune into your glasses, or I tune into what you're saying, and I'm tuning into my environment around me, and I can see there's a picture behind me. So I'm tuning into that. I'm actually looking at it and appreciating it and being grateful for that. So there's that tuning in element, being present. It's the values-based stuff we did before. So mindfulness-based practice is values-based practice. So when we know our values, and for me, authenticity is one of my values. So for me to live authentically is to embrace my mental health and my OCD and my depression and my anxiety. It doesn't mean I like it, but it does mean if I embrace it, and that can apply for anything. It could be applied for parenting or relationships, disability, it could be anything, addiction, you name it. If we embrace it, we can live more authentically. For me, and this is a values-based system, I can then make decisions that are more aligned with where I want to go, not where I've been. So I can make authentic decisions then. I can take off the mask and have a great conversation with you, or I can go and see my GP, or I can go and see my therapist, and I can talk about these things more openly. And then mindfulness is also about connection. It's being mindful of how you're going, and if you're not going so well, connecting with your loved ones, friends, family, work colleagues. We have Are You OK Day here in Australia. I know this year they actually changed it to Are You OK Any Day, by recognizing that we shouldn't just ask that question on one day. We should ask it more frequently. And so for me, mindfulness is about tuning into that regularly. And if I'm struggling 1 month or 2 months or 3 months or 4 months, like it's about going, okay, what do I need to get well? What do I need to feel well? And so it starts with sleep, eating. Am I drinking enough water? Am I getting enough vitamin D? Am I exercising? Am I connecting with other people? Because connection is hugely important. And if I'm not, what can I do today to kind of step back in the right direction as well?
Okay, so how can men balance work, relationships, and OCD management effectively? Because that could be a challenge.
Oh, absolutely. And OCD is, like many mental health conditions, it's an invisible condition. So you don't see it a lot of the time. For some you can see it. So there's like a theme for OCD called contamination OCD. So that's the OCD type where you might have someone who washes their hands regularly because they're worried about getting germs, right? You can see that. But mostly OCD is invisible. You can't see it. You don't know the person's doing it. So I lived with this, and I have largely for over 30 years. And most of the time, people don't know what's happening inside my brain. They can't see it because I'm having this conversation. I've had lots of OCD happening during this conversation, and you wouldn't have had a clue about it because we're just having a conversation. And so managing it in family environments or in work environments or even social environments can be challenging, but it's not impossible. And so the first step is about recognition. So recognizing, okay, something's going on. Do I have something like OCD? And then it's about going in and asking the question from a doctor, psychiatrist, etc. If you have it and it's causing you concern, like, are you going through the right treatment? So are you getting exposure response prevention or ERP? Or are you getting other mindfulness-based things like what mindful men do, like CBT or Mind or ACT or whatever it is? It's about being open with your family or your colleagues as well, as much as you feel safe, because as I said before, OCD can be really scary, the stuff that goes through your mind. And so you need to be able to share it with safe people. You don't want to be just blurting out your OCD themes to people and then scaring them away, because that could impact relationships, whether it's at home, friends, or work. So it's about doing all the stuff in the background so that when you're in those environments, you're managing the best that you can. And that's all you can do. You can always just manage the best that you can. And sometimes you might have a really significant or extreme versions of OCD where you need to change the way that you approach work. So maybe it's like you work from home, or you have different accessibility requirements or adaptability requirements, and you change the way you do things. But for other people, it could be that that's not the issue. Maybe it's the mental load. And so maybe can you provide some of that mental load to your partner? Or can you release some of the burden that's happening in your head through more exercise and eating right? Because there's different ways you can target it. So it's a holistic model. It's not just do one thing and you'll get a response. It's like actually do everything that you need to do. Self-care, connection, as we said before, therapy. For some people, it's medication. I'm on medication because OCD often comes with anxiety as well. So there's two separate conditions. And OCD for a long time was considered an anxiety condition. But it's recently been separated out. Or depression might be an issue as well, or other conditions as well. So autism, for example. OCD is quite common to be a co-occurring condition for people who are autistic as well. So there might be that kind of element as well. And so it's about just managing everything holistically as best as you can and having the right supports around you to inform you. So, knowledge is power. Therapists are great places to go to get knowledge about OCD. So for anyone who has OCD that comes into my clinic, we do a bit of learning about what is OCD. And we did a bit of right at the start of this episode, what is OCD and what do you know about it and the different themes, because a lot of people don't know the themes of OCD. I only learnt this through my therapist. I didn't know it before, and so learning about it as much as you can and then doing what works for you, because there's different things that work for different people. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Okay. So how can men support each other in addressing OCD and other mental health challenges? And what strategies can men use to cope with these intrusive thoughts associated with OCD?
I think supporting each other is having conversations about mental health in general, not just about OCD, but everything. It's like, hey, mate, how are you going? How you're really going, and having those conversations regularly. So that's the biggest part, because when we can do that, it's not just about OCD, but it could be depression, anxiety, it could be stress. Burnout's a big one over the last couple of years, which is prolonged chronic stress. Could be something to do with addiction, your family, work stresses, whatever. Just have conversations and have them regularly. So that's how men can do it. In terms of OCD, there's different groups that you can be part of. So OCD support groups, or working with OCD practitioners that either a lived experience, and if you can find a lived experience practitioner like myself, then you're in good hands because they kind of get it. When I've been seeking treatment for my OCD, I've looked up different therapists, and on their website they say that they treat OCD, but when I've actually called them and say, tell me a bit more about how you treat OCD, they don't really know. They can't tell you a clear example. And so finding practitioners that do exposure response prevention or have that lived experience, which is what I've got, goes a long way to dealing with it and managing it, because you don't also have to live with OCD forever. You can actually reduce the symptoms and the severity so that you're not technically classified as having OCD. It's not a lifelong thing, but it can be a lifelong thing as well at the same time. And it kind of goes in waves. Like at the moment, I'm going through a more of a significant OCD period, whereas other times I'm less OCD. So it's a bit of a wave, it's a journey. And so knowing that in itself is a way that we can support each other, and sharing stories. Listening to podcasts like this is a great way. There's different OCD podcasts as well that you can just get information, or read books about OCD. You've got the International OCD Federation, which is great for information. There's also another website called NoCD, so it's NOCD. It's an American-based website, but they've got a lot of education about what OCD is and how do you treat it, and get additional support. Just find your little niche, find somewhere that you can get information, and off you go.
Okay, so what are the benefits of community-based therapy sessions for men dealing with OCD?
Yeah, I guess you've touched on exactly what we do at Mindful Men. So we take therapy out of a clinic. And we do that because not every guy wants to sit in a clinic and be therapized. They don't want to sit there and maybe bawl their eyes out. There's a bit of a shame and stigma associated with that. And so this is not just for OCD. We do this with all of our clients as much as possible. And that includes in the mental health space, parenting, work stresses, but also the disability spaces, we take therapy out of a clinic. We do it for a couple of reasons. One, to make it a bit easier for guys, and we go for a walk. We just walk side by side because that's a bit easier for two guys to talk about things when they're not eyeballing each other from the other side of the room. That can be really challenging. Or we might, do something a bit different. So for some of my clients, we go get a coffee, and the act of having a cup of coffee is more social, but we can still talk about the issues that are going on, and we can still bring in all the therapy stuff as well, all the CBTs or ACTs or ERPs, whatever it is. But we can do it in a less clinical way. We're still getting the same benefit, but less clinical way. But also the benefit of getting out and about and being upright is that we're also moving. So there's some gentle exercise, which is great for our mental health. And we're getting vitamin D, so sunlight, fresh air, which also helps our mental health as well. So at the end of these community-based sessions, and I do a lot of it at the beach, for example, I live on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, so we have lots of beautiful beaches, is that we holistically address our mental health by talking about what's going on, walking, getting sunlight, fresh air, and also getting the therapy tools behind that to support whatever challenge it is, whether it's OCD or another mental health condition or life challenge in itself.
Okay, so what resources are available for men seeking support for OCD through Mindful Men?
Yeah, so I've got the Mindful Men podcast where I've shared my story over 139 episodes. So that's my story, but it's also a variety of stories. It's not just OCD. So we talk about a whole range of different, whether it's mental health conditions, disabilities, or, finances, parenting, a whole range of different supports from that holistic perspective. And the idea with the podcast is just to share stories, to listen to different stories, a bit like yours, is to share stories and hear inspiration from somebody else. So that's one thing that Mindful Men does. We also like to connect people with different community groups as well. So we know of a few community groups, particularly for men around our area, where we can connect men in and make them feel connected, but we're also exploring creating our own as well. But then, as I said before, there's more global information from things like the International OCD Federation that you can go to. There's a new OCD Australia group that is meeting on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, and it's done via Zoom. So we're meeting a whole bunch of OCDers across Australia, which is really cool, and getting some people from international as well to come in and share their insights as well. So that's available. If anyone wants to hear more about that, they can certainly flick me a message or an email. I can share the link to that group as well. There's not much around in Australia, but to be honest, though, the Australian OCD space is very small and very quiet. You probably do get more on social media via the US, and that's where I've connected in with a few OCDs myself and building my networks globally to learn about what's out there, who's out there, what's going on. But yeah, there are resources around. You've just got to hunt around for them as much as you can.
Exactly. And one final question to end the podcast. We always ask this to every guest here on the Deep Dive podcast. Is that if there's one bit of advice in 30 seconds or less that you would actually sort of say to people, what would that be?
It's not weak to speak. And I think this is very good for men, is that recognizing you need help, it's okay. Asking for help, it's going to be okay. And then you can actually move on as well. So it's very short, very sharp, but I think it's specifically for guys. It's not weak to speak.
And on that note, thank you very much, Simon Ren, for being part of the Deep Dive podcast today.
Cheers, Michael.
For more information, go to mindfulmen.com.au or check out their Instagram page at mindful.men.aus.